Hey, we're back here on Inside the Vandals, and joining us now, Director of Athletics, Dr. Rob Spear. Thanks so much for being with us.
Tom, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Now, the last thing you expected going down to Florida, Gainesville, playing in that game was for you to return with no game being played. I mean, what was going through your mind as all this was unfolding?
Well, it was extremely unusual, and the word I've been using has been bizarre. Never in my mind did I ever think we wouldn't play the game. But there were so many things going on throughout the game as far as the lightning strikes, and at some point in time you thought that the weather pattern would pass through and we would eventually play the game.
Now, what was happening as this decision was being made? Was there pretty consistent communication going on between you and the athletic department at the University of Florida? What was going on there?
Well, as soon as we had the first delay, I went down and spent most of my time in the game operations room and was tracking the lightning strikes like everybody else. And those lightning strikes were occurring virtually every 5 minutes. And when they occur, you have 30 minutes after the last lightning strike before you can even bring your teams back onto the field.
Oh.
We agreed that we would have a 10-minute warm-up. So from the last lightning strike, it was really going to be 40 minutes until kickoff. So we were trying to get that information, update our coaching staff where it was at, and it was just constant communication throughout the evening. And then, of course, as we got into the evening, there were a whole host of other issues because of the weather pattern.
Now, how maddening is that when there has to be 30 minutes between a lightning strike? Say if one happens at 29 minutes, does it restart the clock?
It does. It absolutely restarts the clock. So it has to be lightning strikes within 8 miles of the stadium restarted that clock.
Now, what is going on logistically behind the scenes? I mean, obviously you have a team that's ready to play at a certain time, but with a 3-hour delay, how do you take care of them? What do you guys have to do as an athletic staff?
Well, one of the things that became an issue was because as the delays kept happening is we felt that we had to fuel up our players again. They had a pregame meal that was 4 or 5 hours before, and so we had to make a decision to order in sandwiches to our players so they could have something to eat, so we had the appropriate fuel for their bodies. Because we anticipated this game could be delayed up to 3 hours. So that's one of the things that we did is we ordered in some sub sandwiches, which is another interesting story in itself.
And then talking to you, before we came on here, you guys were working with an Idaho grad. He was a field operations manager there. What's the story there?
Well, Jason Cruz is a proud University of Idaho graduate, got his degree in crop science in 1999, and lo and behold, he oversees the turf at the Florida Stadium, and he's a faculty member at the University of Florida. And so he was very instrumental in providing us details on the safety of the field and the conditions of the field, especially later on, because it wasn't only the lightning that was an issue later on.
Yeah.
It was we had significant water that hit the field, and the field drained fairly well, but the turf, the natural grass was saturated, and as Jason explained, that he felt it was not in the best interest of our players or the University of Florida players to take that field because it might withhold one series, but after that the field was going to be a mess, and then you start worrying about the safety of student athletes. And the last thing that we ever want to do is put our student athletes in a dangerous situation, and especially with the whole emphasis on student athlete welfare today. So it was a fairly easy decision when you had his input that the game shouldn't be played on that field.
Now, what exactly was the conversation once it was decided this game wasn't going to happen? What are the options going into this decision? Obviously, because with you guys going down to Florida, it's like, do you make up the game? What happens?
Those were all the discussions we had. The number one thing is we needed to decide whether we're going to play the game that evening. The later it got into the evening, the University of Idaho felt it was going to be our advantage because we were on the Pacific time zone, and the University of Florida said if we didn't get this thing kicked off by 10 o'clock, that they didn't want to play the game at all. Well, once it did get kicked off, the decision of whether or not to play the game fell strictly in the hands of the lead official. And so the lead official had to make the decision on whether or not that game was going to continue. We had a lot of conversations of shortening the game. We talked about going from 15-minute quarters to 12-minute quarters.
Wow.
And so there were a lot of conversations. But at the end, it was a conversation with the official, the turf manager, both athletic directors, and both head football coaches. And it was an easy decision not to play the game because of the safety hazard with the condition of the field. But we didn't really talk about where we were going to go. We threw a few dates around of what might be able to happen about rescheduling the game, and those discussions are still ongoing.
Now, did you talk to Paul after the game, and if so, what was said between you guys?
Well, we talked to Paul throughout the course, keeping him briefed about what was happening and the delays, but certainly we talked about what was going to happen after the game and ideally when he would want to play the game. It's interesting that both schools have a bye week on 10/25, but if you look at that schedule, that would mean the University of Idaho is playing 10 consecutive weeks. And when you talk about student-athlete welfare, I don't think it's great for anybody to play 10 consecutive weeks. And I think Florida is really 9 consecutive weeks, and I know they have Georgia on 11/1, so they wanted to have 2 weeks to prepare for Georgia. So I'm not saying 10/25 is not going to work. We talked about a December time frame, about maybe playing a game in December. Those discussions are still ongoing.
Now, how is it though? Now the football team moves forward, and obviously these discussions are still ongoing. But now they move forward from a football playing standpoint. Is it nice to turn around and have a very crucial conference opener to kind of take your minds off this situation from a football playing standpoint?
Our kids need to play a game, and that was the most disappointing thing when I talked with Coach Petrino, is he wanted to get reps for our players. We knew the University of Florida was going to be a tough opponent, but it was so important for us to be able to go play against somebody else and hit against somebody else and not our own players. So that game is still awaiting, and usually every coach will tell you that the most improvement is between that first and second game. Now, we don't have the luxury of having between a first and second game, as we know now Louisiana Monroe is going to be the first game, but I think our kids are going to be more than ready to play the game for sure.
Absolutely. Now, what changes now? How is it different this season being a part of the Sun Belt Conference as compared to last year being independent for you? What's it like?
It's night and day. It's a huge thing for the University of Idaho to be in a conference. It is unreasonable to think that you can put together an independent schedule every year. And I always tell people that we were lucky to get that schedule put together last year. And the only reason that we had luck is because there was so much transition and so much realignment happening during that year. So if there was ever a year for the University of Idaho to pursue independence, it was last year. But having 8 conference games scheduled for you and being in a conference and having your players be able to compete for all conference awards and being able to compete for a conference championship, it's something that we had to have. And I feel good that we made the decision to go independent because we felt anything else would have been short-sighted. And we knew there would be some additional realignment that would help the University of Idaho. And so here we are a year later, and we're in the Sun Belt.
Now, one of the big discussions that is, float in the media today, are college athletes going to be paid? And obviously there's a lot of debate on either side of the coin. Is that something that the Sun Belt is talking about? And what goes into that decision? How is that decision even made? Is that something that they go to every athletic director and every program in the conference and talk to them? I guess what I'm asking is, what's kind of the main thing that's going on with that right now?
Well, very complex issue, especially for schools at our level. And the one conversation that we've had briefly, but haven't made a decision on, is once this governance model is formally adopted, there's still an override process. My feeling is that it won't be overridden, that the governance model would be put in place, thus allowing all this autonomy for the Power 5 conferences. How are we going to be able to compete with that? We have had some discussions, but we don't know yet whether or not the individual institutions within a conference are going to make that decision, or does the conference as a whole make the decision so everybody's in it together? And to even make it more complex, we're in 2 different conferences, so we have that issue to deal with.
He's Dr. Rob Spear, Athletic Director here at the University of Idaho. Rob, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Tom.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.